It feels like such an auspicious occasion to be actually meeting you all in person, so I'm standing, at least for the beginning. Hello and welcome to the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. Now, I've been looking forward to saying that for weeks and weeks and weeks, so I'm going to say it again because, that's probably the lightest thing you're going to hear from me for the next hour. So, hello and welcome to the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. I'm Jennifer Byrne and I'm delighted to welcome you here to the Metcalfe Auditorium for this panel that will be so interesting, a panel on modern slavery with expert panellists Justine Nolan and Martijn Boersma. We acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and recognise the Gadigal people as the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We do have a few COVID protocols that I'd like to run through with you. First of all, social distancing means that we have to keep 1.5 metres away from each other. There is hand sanitizer at the door, so please use it regularly. Please respect the protocols yourselves, and we know what they are. No handshaking, hugging, kissing, and so on. Please mute your mobile phones, and if you want to take a picture of these superstars, you're welcome to do so, but please turn off the flash because you might startle them. Feel free to share this on social media at Bad Crimes Sydney or hashtag Bad Crimes Sydney. Now, at the end, we're going to have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. And that's going to be really exciting because none of us have been in a room with real people like this since the beginning of March. So it feels like a novel experience, and it is thrilling, isn't it? So let me begin. Professor Justine Nolan is an academic in the Faculty of Law at the University of New South Wales. Justine is internationally recognised as an expert and scholar in the area of business and human rights and in supply chain regulation. This year, in recognition of her expertise, she was appointed to the Australian Government Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group. Please welcome Justine. Dr. Martijn Boersma is an academic at the University of Technology, Sydney, in the Business School. Martijn explores the intersection of business and society, particularly the impact of business on society and the effect of business on people. Martijn has worked in civil society in large organisations like Greenpeace, and he's worked in the Australian trade union movement. He's involved in two practical initiatives, very exciting initiatives, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to speak about them today. One is called the Cleaning Accountability Framework, which is extraordinary, and the other is a new project on the Australian cotton industry and looking at value chains in the cotton industry with the aim of improving the lives of people working in those industries. Now I'm going to sit down. And I'm going to begin by asking you both how you came to write the book. But before I do that, I'm going to refer to the book. This is the book, Addressing Modern Slavery, written in 2019, published by University of New South Wales Press. It is extraordinary. It will be available for you to buy and have signed by the authors after the session. The book has over 47 pages of footnotes. It is a scholarly book, but it is so accessible. It's a wonderful book to read. And I just want to explain about one of my favourite parts of the book. Because what these two have done is to look at modern slavery in the context of slavery historically. In 1787, which is a date that has a particular resonance for many of us, in 1787, Ottobah Cuguano wrote, "Being in this dreadful captivity and horrible slavery without any hope of deliverance for about 8 or 9 months, beholding the most dreadful scenes of misery and cruelty, and seeing my miserable companions often cruelly lashed and, as it were, cut to pieces for the most trifling faults. But I escaped." And then Yum in Cambodia in 2017. "We sailed for days and days before they told us we'd been sold to the Thais to work as fishermen. I went to the captain and complained. He beat me so badly it was impossible for me to work, eat or sleep. I thought I was going to die. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. My health and the beatings got worse." It's an important book, it's a significant book. It speaks about modern slavery in our world today, but links it to exploitation throughout history. And really, the language may have changed. Modern slavery would not have been a term used in 1787, but the harm exacted on people is the same. So, Justine, can you tell us how you came to write the book?
Sure. I mean, for me, I guess to put it in context is I started working in this field around looking at the impacts on human rights and business more than 25 years ago now. And it was time when I was studying and working in the US, when there was sort of more control in the government at that point. But I was there, and it was around the time that there was a lot of attention on sweatshops. And so big companies like Nike and Reebok and Adidas at the time were being pressured about their supply chains. And I got a job with an international human rights organisation. I wasn't an academic. I was working as an international human rights lawyer. And I started to work in this field. And as part of my work, I would go out into different countries and start to look at, and talk with workers in factories. And there was no way of getting around the exploitation that these people were experiencing. And all that time back, it was when companies were starting to think about these issues, but the reaction of companies was much more like, "Don't talk to me, you're pretty annoying, we're going to do this, but they're not our workers." They're in Southeast Asia at the time, mostly Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia before China boomed. And so they would say, "It's not our problem." And so that's what got me sort of hooked in the area. And then around that time, the US government and others started to get involved and interested in the problem. And so I could see law as both a sort of a useful thing and also a useless thing in changing this. And I needed that. I knew that we had to get business's attention. So over the years, I kept working in this area around supply chain regulation. And then in the last few years, there's been a lot of interest in this concept of modern slavery. And it's sort of, as Jennifer said, slavery's been around for hundreds of years. But this new label, modern slavery, sort of caught everyone's attention. And caught companies' attention, because no company ever wants to be for modern slavery. So every company is against modern slavery. And so Martijn and I were starting to be interested in looking at, well, what does that mean? What does it mean if you're against it? What are you doing? Who are the people being impacted? Because lots of numbers, millions of people are caught in modern slavery. And what we tend to forget is that there's a human attached to each of those numbers. So that was sort of an extension of the earlier work I did, and we both got very interested in looking at where's this going and how's it going to be regulated, how's it going to be fixed.
Thanks, Justine. Martijn, what was the hook that got you into this area?
I think for me it was initially supply chains, like with Justine. When I worked at Greenpeace back in the early 2000s, I noticed that they were pressuring these large companies such as McDonald's about deforestation in the Amazon. And I was like, okay, what's the link there between McDonald's and deforestation? And what they did was they said, well, you need all that soy to feed all the cattle to make your hamburgers, and that's leading to deforestation. So I was sort of fascinated with that strategy, but also with the idea that, we have a supply chain and all those items that we use every day. They go through a journey. They come from a raw material. They are manufactured somewhere. Then they're, transported somewhere. And along that sort of journey, a lot of people are in contact with that product. And in the cases that we research, there are a lot of people that are abused in that context. And then, as Justine pointed out, modern slavery is one of these things that have more recently become very topical. And I had a background already looking at working conditions, having worked in the trade union movement. And one of the key points that we try and make in the book is we talk very much about a continuum of exploitation. So modern slavery is obviously one of the worst kinds of labor exploitation, if not the worst kinds that you can get. But you don't get from 0 to 100 in one go. There's always sort of a slippery slope towards that. And I think that's something that we've tried to explore in the book as well. And I think specifically with the introduction of the Modern Slavery Act in the United Kingdom and in Australia, that sort of caught public attention, and we thought, well, that's sort of a little perfect storm for us to look at this issue.
We'll come back to the Modern Slavery Act, but Martijn, modern slavery, it's a handy term. What does it actually mean?
That's a very good question. It's a bit of an umbrella term, and if you look closely in the media, then it's oftentimes actually misused. So a lot of the instances of wage theft, for example, underpayment or wage non-compliance, as the industry people like to call it, that was oftentimes also conflated with modern slavery. But the key point with modern slavery is that people can't leave that particular employment relationship, and they're performing the labor under duress. So there is some sort of form of coercion involved. Doesn't mean that they don't get paid anything. People can still be paid and coerced to do work, but the important thing is that they don't have an avenue for exiting the employment relationship, and they are performing that work under coercion.
Yeah, thanks. Justine, how do we see this in supply chains? Look, we're all here in our best, I'm struggling to remember the month, in our best gear, but what about our clothes? Where is there modern slavery in our clothes?
So it's the sad thing is it's sort of pretty much everywhere. So the coffee you drank today, the fruit you might have eaten, the T-shirt you're wearing, the phone you're using, the laptop you're using. Most of the supply chains these days are tainted by modern slavery. So the numbers are sort of large. So it's estimated to be there's more than 40 million people in modern slavery, and 25 million of those are working in supply chains. So there's very few goods that are not touched in some way by modern slavery. And it's almost impossible. So when you think about modern slavery, most people think it's something that happens over there. And so, it doesn't really affect me. There's nothing that I can do about it. But if you look at many times, if you trace the journey of your genes, the journey of your phone. So most phones these days have an element of cobalt in it. The majority of cobalt's coming from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And, estimates of forced labour in that country are above 90%. 85% of the world's chocolate and cocoa beans come from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. So again, over 80% of those beans are made with forced labour. So the garment textile industry, a lot of goods coming from parts of South Asia and Turkey, and so if you think of the T-shirt that you've got, you think often of the manufacturing factory. So that might be Bangladesh or China largely these days. But where did the cotton come from before that? Did it come from Turkey, Uzbekistan, Xinjiang in China? And all of these areas are hotspots of forced labour. It might have come from Australia, the cotton, but then it might be then used in a product down the stream where people are being forced in a workplace. So it's very hard to find, a so-called pure supply chain, and it's good to think about it as relating to us. So in Australia, for example, fruit pickers, at the moment there's a lot of attention on agricultural workers, where there's workers being classified both as wage theft, and some of them are on this sort of exploitation area that Martijn talked about as modern slavery in Australia.
Martijn, just from your work in the cotton industry, can you tell us about exploitation of people there that you might be seeing?
Yeah, sure. So the Australian cotton industry is largely automated. So there's not a lot of people that would be physically, I don't think there's any actually, that are physically getting the cotton from, the plant like they would in Uzbekistan, which we know is a bit of a hotbed in that regard. Their issue is when we export our cotton to overseas industries, what happens to it then? So usually what happens with supply chains, normally we get retailers such as H&M that are being forced to scrutinize their supply chain. So that's all the way at the end of the value chain. When they're trying to sell it, they want to know where it comes from. But in this case, the Australian cotton industry is actually very proactive in this, and they want to find out where their cotton goes and what they can do to make sure that their product is not sort of tainted in any way by modern slavery. So it's actually a very ambitious thing to do because if you think about what a value chain would look like and how hard it would be to track a particular item, particularly cotton that might get mixed with other types of cotton, then that's a very ambitious project. And I think that's where a lot of companies also run into the weeds, in that their supply chains have become so intricate that it's very tough to find out where goods are coming from, let alone where they go to and what happens to them then.
Justine, we've got goods coming into Australia. You've mentioned jeans or coffee, chocolate and so on. We know about goods going out of Australia, cotton and so on. What's the impact of COVID?
Yes, I mean, the impact of COVID, particularly in the manufacturing industry, has basically exacerbated exploitative working conditions because workers have a lot less power. So the power imbalance tends to be drastically in favour of the employer rather than the worker, particularly where there are low-skill industries, where the supply of workers is generally higher than the demand. So with COVID, what we've seen is that some large companies around the world, some have reacted very well and some have behaved very badly. So on the bad end is companies who have basically tried to cancel orders, seek discounts for orders. So this would be already where, say, the factory in Bangladesh has basically either outsourced or some subcontracted side of the product, or they've got all the raw materials in and they're making it. And at that stage, the brand is saying, actually, we only need half of that, so you can keep all of that. So they're trying to get out of their contracts. But we've also seen other companies behave well and set up programs where they've tried to support workers and ensure that the contracts are being paid and actually being paid early to do it. So there's been, a mix of reactions.
Can you give us some examples of companies that are doing it really well?
So actually my jeans today are from a company in Queensland, a small Australian company called Outland Denim. And I always wear them when I'm going to do a talk like this because I feel so guilt-free. Because always someone comes up afterwards and says, what have you got on? I'm like, oh my God. You can imagine my poor children when they're trying to buy clothes. Nope, you can't have that, can't have that, can't have that. So there's a company in Queensland called Outland Denim, which is a small company that's growing fast, and it basically owns and operates its own factories, which is very rare in this industry. And it was set up as a purpose-built company. So it's set up basically first employing trafficked women. So women who'd been trafficked, and they set up a factory in Cambodia. They're expanding. Now I think they're in Bloomingdale's in New York. They're in David Jones, and you can get them online here. But they're a purpose-built business, but they're trying to basically align their business purpose and profit with it. And so they're one of the smaller companies that's doing it. But there are other larger companies. So, I mean, fast fashion is obviously always talked about as the problem. But even within fast fashion these days, you see somewhere like H&M, they've got conscious sort of consumer lines within those areas. So there's no big brand that isn't going to have a problem. They're all going to have problems. But sometimes within the company itself, they're having dedicated conscious sort of consumer lines that it's useful to support. A company like Marks & Spencer in the UK has made a lot of effort in the last 5 years to make their supply chain more transparent. And so they're pushing that. Even really, really large companies like Unilever, which has got as many bad problems as sort of, good answers, they're making concerted efforts in some areas. So there's always a bad example, and we've got hundreds of bad examples. But there are companies that are trying to make an effort, and there's also, we can get to, sort of sources that you can look at to find those companies.
So Meghan Markle.
Oh yeah, Meghan Markle and me, who
Meghan
Markle wore the jeans. She got a lot more attention than I ever have, but she wore the jeans, and then the brand did explode a little bit. But I'm expecting somewhat of a similar effect after today.
I'm sure everybody will be going up.
30 of us are going to get online.
Martijn, what about the cleaning accountability framework? How does that fit in?
First, I'd like to make a quick addition to what Justine said about COVID, because I don't think it's just a matter of brands not willing to pay for outstanding orders or asking for delayments of payment. delay of payments. The problem is that a lot of people that work in those supply chains are incredibly precariously employed. So the moment that the demand for new goods basically imploded, all those people basically, their employers there locally had no responsibility towards them. It's like, well, there's no work, so there's no pay. And what happens in that situation, and we've tried to get into that in the book as well, then those people are forced with like really tough life choices. And that's where I suppose the element of crime also comes in, because then there's always people who try and take sort of advantage of those people's desperate situations. So that's been another edition, I suppose, of COVID. Little segue to cleaning. I think so. The cleaning accountability framework is, in short, it's a multi-stakeholder framework that looks at cleaning in the commercial real estate industry in Australia. So what happens is those big building owners, they've got these big office buildings, and they get to clean those buildings, obviously. And the competition in that industry has been completely cutthroat. So we've had various layers of outsourcing where people are, outsourcing it, and the margins become thinner and thinner, and oftentimes it's the labor aspect that they try to undercut. So basically what in those instances happen is that you have a lot of international students working in those industries that are not always familiar with the labor rights. What happens is that they have a work restriction, so they can only work 20 hours a fortnight, I believe. What happens then, clearly we know all about the cost of living in Sydney. They work more than the 20 hours, and then their employer says, well, you're in a bit of trouble now, but we'll keep it on the down low, but also I'm also going to pay you less, or I'm going to ask you to take money out of the ATM and pay me back so that it looks like I'm paying you properly, etc. And that's the crime element, where we have employers and people trying to think of, it's almost like the dark side of business innovation. They try and find ways to sort of, exploit those situations and exploit those people. So the cleaning accountability framework, in short, what it does, it tries to make sure that the bottom doesn't drop out of the market. So it gets all those stakeholders together, and it says, this get a little bit technical, but during the contract tendering process, they make sure that there's enough money in the contract to make sure that the cleaners are being paid their legal entitlements. So there's also a worker engagement element in there as well, so that the cleaners themselves are involved in that project. But that's one of the ways in which a lot of stakeholders, such as regulators, trade unions, companies, have come together and fill the void a little bit in terms of the undersourced labour inspectorate that we have in Australia.
So thanks, Martijn. So let's think about filling the void. We know that modern slavery is a global problem. We know that there are more than 40 million people experiencing modern slavery throughout the world, and thousands in Australia. What needs to happen? What is government doing? Justine?
So government in Australia has passed a law called the Australian Modern Slavery Act in 2018 that went into effect in 2019. New South Wales has also passed its own law in 2018, but that's not yet in effect. And Jennifer can talk a little bit about that, because she was the interim anti-slavery commission in New South Wales as they've been in the process of trying to get that law through. But in Australia, so there's basically a law that requires companies that have more than $100 million in annual consolidated revenue to basically issue a modern slavery statement, where they're meant to identify the risks of modern slavery in their operations and supply chains, and then report what they're doing about it. So this is mostly that large segment of Australian companies, and we expect there to be about 3,000 of them. So the Australian government has set up a modern slavery register on the Commonwealth Government site, on the Home Affairs site, and when those first statements come up, you'll be able to go in and search and have a look at the statements as the companies are doing it. So what this is trying to do, the goal of this is trying to spur companies to proactively, do their due diligence, think about where they're getting the goods from, how they're running their operations, and encourage their suppliers to work and improve practices. So that's the goal. The UK beat us to the Act, and they've had an Act since 2015. It hasn't quite panned out quite like that. what we've seen sometimes is some companies have made serious efforts and have really changed business practices. There's a lot of companies who've spent time publishing beautiful looking reports that just really say nothing, and they've done nothing, they haven't really substantively looked at their business model or changed their practices. So the question, I think, for us is to look at regulation as part of the picture. Transparency is part of this, like being able to find out where goods are, looking at the supply chain. But transparency can't be the end goal. And at the moment with our law, transparency is sort of it, and our law doesn't include any penalties. So if companies don't report, the idea is that people like us or the market or investors will pressure them to report. The New South Wales law has a penalty built in, but it's not yet in effect. But the idea is to engage business as a partner in doing this, and so the government is trying to set up a regulatory framework. I just don't think they've quite got that sweet spot yet where it's going to get business to actually act in a substantive way.
What do you think, Martijn? Is it a toothless tiger, the Modern Slavery Act?
Yeah, I've grown more cynical over time, unfortunately. So this is what Justine referred to, the fact that there's an absence of penalties for companies. That means it relies on market enforcement effectively. So investors should take their money out of companies if they don't do good reporting or they don't do any reporting at all. But we've seen in other areas, that doesn't really work. So one example that I refer to often is the Workplace Gender Equality Act, which was introduced in 2012, and that requires ASX-listed companies and other large companies in Australia to report on the amount of women in the boardroom, amount of women in senior management, what they're doing to facilitate female career progression, etc. In that case as well, there's also one other important one, gender pay gap. And they don't have any penalties if they don't comply. They get a sort of pat on the back from the government and they're branded an employer of choice if they do well. But otherwise, again, it's up to investors and consumers to deal with that. But clearly, we know that the gender pay gap has been reducing at a glacial pace. So clearly, that enforcement mechanism has a number of shortfalls. And it's only a matter of time, I think, until that comes to the fore in the context of the Modern Slavery Act as well. Sorry to be so cynical about it.
Oh, no, I'm going to offer a different view.
Good.
I've been formulating it busily as I've been hearing you both. So the Modern Slavery Act, I think it's extraordinary. It's not perfect. It is not perfect. We've heard from Justine that it will affect 3,000 big companies who have to look into their operations. That's how they do what they're meant to be doing. So in the university context, it might be universities looking at who they're employing in cleaning or hospitality, where they're buying minerals for lab experiments, where they're getting rubber gloves and so on. So that's the way that the university does its business. We teach, we do experiments in labs, we do other kinds of work as well. So the Act will require large institutions to look into their own way of operating and try and identify the risk of modern slavery. And then, as you've heard, it will also require the institutions to think about their supply chains. So there aren't penalties. It's going to affect 3,000 companies, but there are flow-on effects, aren't there? So when these big organisations are preparing their modern slavery statements, they're asking companies that they buy from what they're doing. So if the university's buying in rubber gloves, they're going to ask the rubber glove seller, what are you doing about modern slavery? Now, it's not perfect, but it is a question. It is a step in a journey, and there are opportunities to review the Act, to improve it. There will be a review of the Act in around 2022, I think. So it's a beginning. It really is a beginning.
It is a beginning, but I guess we challenge that a little bit because we talk to companies a lot, and you sort of said my trigger word because companies are always on a journey.
It was journey. I did it deliberately.
Journey just sends me off, because you go in, you're sitting in the boardroom, and they're like, we're all on the journey. And I'm like, I'm not on your journey.
I think it's an excellent word.
So their journey to human rights is always very long. It's very slow. It's very winding. And I always ask them, well, how's your journey to profit going? Is that sort of the same windy road? And they're like, it's as much about the journey as the destination. And I'm like, same for profit? Is it all about the journey or is it about the profit at the end? Because, essentially what they're doing to human rights is they're basically saying, we're going to outsource this. So does the government say, we've got this great tax law, but we're not going to have penalties because we think everybody's going to do it and we're just going to let you all pressure each other into paying your tax. And you're like, no. So why is that okay on social issues that we basically say, let's put it out to the market and let the market regulate it? So there is something about what Jennifer's saying, and I agree with her in saying that it is extraordinary to get business sort of in a regulated framework really tackling these social issues. But we've had environmental impact assessments for years, so this is taking it into a different direction. And I think it's extraordinary at getting attention, awareness raising. I'm not convinced that it's going to translate into changing the business model without some other steps. But you know,
Can I add?
Justine, I'm just going to ask Justine one follow-up question. As a member of the Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group, is this the message you're giving to government?
yes, but they often turn me off on Zoom. So the government is very very interested in this issue, and it is clearly a priority of our government. I think they feel that they've got there and they've done what they need to do, and then everything will work out. And so, but they are open to hearing critical voices, and they are open to hearing about how it can be improved. So, as you said, maybe in 2022, that's what they'll look at. But they've definitely played a serious role in taking it on.
Martijn.
Well, two things. The government being open to hearing voices. We actually had to lobby to get civil society representatives on this group that Justine is part of. Like initially, there was no representation from a trade union or other labor rights organizations. It was actually pretty industry heavy, if you will. So we had to lobby for that. But what I think as well about the Modern Slavery Act, like I agree with Justine, with Jen, that there's scope to improve it over time. But from my experience in the cleaning accountability framework, ultimately when push comes to shove, they talk about cost. It's all about money in the end. And we talk about in the cleaning industry, we had to drag some industry players to the table, kicking and screaming, for them to pay the legal minimum that people are entitled to. So, when they ultimately, and we had this in the university sector as well, this is being recorded. Can I talk poorly about my employer? Anyway, so...
it is being recorded.
Oh, it is being recorded. I don't care.
Just as long as you never want to get promoted, it's fine.
That's fine. No one's getting promoted in COVID. So... They had an issue in their cleaning supply chain. So what happened was, if someone wanted to change a location of a building they were cleaning, they were forced to pay their employer a fee, cash in hand, to move buildings, which is completely illegal. We flagged that issue with UTS, and they were just incredulous, and that surely that couldn't be the case, etc., etc. But ultimately, I think when push comes to shove, and when we've had those conversations with procurement managers, that's all they have. We do the right thing, But ultimately, when stuff goes to tender, they'll pick the contract that's cheapest. So, that bottom line in many ways speaks loudest. And if we keep on relying on market enforcement, I'm afraid that will keep on being the case.
And this is why the kind of model that you've been developing, the multi-stakeholder initiative model, is potentially so effective. Yep.
Well, it's interesting. So I've also been on a journey in this particular project.
We do it to annoy Justine.
I started off being really excited about this voluntary multi-stakeholder framework, and I thought it was great. And it does rely on market enforcement ultimately. But I've grown increasingly skeptical about what it is that it can do, because a lot of the industry partners have, they're just happy to be seen as doing something, so they're part of this initiative. They can put a logo in their annual report, etc., and they're not necessarily as committed as they should be. So ultimately, for me, a well-resourced and active labor inspectorate is still the way to go. But
let's talk about that. So how to get workers involved, how to get unions involved.
Yeah, well, and this is also something that relates to the Modern Slavery Act. So we have, in the UK, for example, we had a conservative government introducing the Modern Slavery Act. In Australia, we had a conservative government introduce the Modern Slavery Act. But when you talk to them about, workers' rights and unions, it's all scum. So I'm like, that's what we do in the book. We talk about the continuum of exploitation, and you can't sort of talk about, well, we take modern slavery very seriously without sort of saying, well, we take decent work very seriously. Sorry, I went off on a tangent with the question.
How to get workers involved, how to get the worker voice.
Well, that's very challenging, specifically for the marginalized groups and the people that are susceptible to modern slavery, because they're oftentimes migrant workers, that might not be familiar with the labor rights. Maybe they don't speak the language that well, and that can be very, very challenging to get those people on board. Unions are trying to do outreach projects, but because part of the labor force is also so transient, it's really hard to map that and engage those people. So that's definitely one of the challenges, that a lot of these people are sort of invisible. Yeah.
When people are invisible, they're often undocumented. They're in Australia without a visa. There's been calls recently for some kind of regularisation or amnesty process that would allow people to come forward and get some kind of status. And this would be intended to aid the labour market. What do you think about that concept?
Oh, I think that's a really good idea. I think right now a lot of people are afraid to go to authorities because they're being seen as the perpetrator. Like they're the ones overstaying their visa somehow. They're the ones that are in breach of some condition. Whereas if you would have an amnesty, then they would feel perhaps that they weren't going to be treated as, we're going to be deported, but rather they could bring their abusive employer to justice. So I'm all in favor of that. Yeah.
Justine?
I agree.
Yep. What about so we've looked at government. What about other people or organisations that have a role? And I'm thinking about investors.
Yeah, so investors have a really important role here, because companies will sometimes listen to people like us and sometimes listen to consumers, but they will always listen to investors. And so investors have actually started to get really quite proactive on social issues. So, most recently in Australia, you've seen it in relation to Rio Tinto and Yukon Gorge, where there was pressure on investors to basically, circle around and say, this is not acceptable, your response in relation to this. We've seen it in relation to ANZ Bank as well. So on a number of issues, both social, human rights issues, environmental issues, investors are starting to use their leverage to basically say, we need to think about how you do this. And we're not saying here, business has got to take this over. It's their responsibility as social. Like all of these issues are basically part of the puzzle. So government's part of the puzzle, consumers are part of the puzzle, investors and companies are all part of the puzzle. But where we are now, as opposed to say in the 1970s, people generally accept that companies have an impact on communities, and so their impact on environment and on human rights is now not considered irrelevant, which largely was, say, 1970s and even the early 80s, etc. And so businesses are stepping up, and so we're not saying they shouldn't make a profit. They need to make a profit because we need them to have money to be able to do this and to do the work. But we also need to think about, sort of what their broader impact is, and investors have been, not all, but some have been useful in that regard.
It's been really impressive. Justine, you've spoken about consumers a couple of times. Is there anything you want to add there? What's the role of consumers?
Yeah, I guess we take a little bit of a cynical approach in, you can tell already we're cynical about a lot of things
they're so
in the book. So, because a lot of times, what we're seeing with these new laws is basically saying consumers will save us. And the role of consumers is important, particularly conscious consumers. So it's not so much that the small niche of ethical consumers who are going to save us, because people look at that group and say, well, everything will change. But that's a really small group of consumers who think about everything they do and everything they buy. And often it means that they are spending more, because sometimes these small, more conscious products, whether it's, organic goods or well-made goods, are a little bit more. And so the average consumer will go in to buy, a T-shirt, and if there's one for $10 and if there's one for $30 and they look pretty similar, they're going to get the $10 T-shirt. And so the consumer will fluctuate, and I think consumers have a really important role a lot of time to questioning companies. So for asking them, what are you doing about your supply chain? Leaving them comments on social media about that. But I don't think the ethical consumer is going to save, this issue, but I think they have a role to play.
And what about certification? When we go to the supermarkets, we can buy chocolate that's been certified fair trade, fair supply. What do you think, Martijn?
Yeah, look, you can, but there's a bit of a problem with some of those certification standards, in that there are literally dozens and dozens of them. So a lot of people get confused. They see a green tick on a product and they think, okay, well, that surely means something good. And there's been studies about specifically certified tea in plantations, where it actually turned out that the working conditions on the certified plantations were actually worse than on the uncertified plantations. So certification is something that brings challenges with it as well, specifically because we have to remember that those certifications are all private initiatives. They're again to fill the void of well-resourced labor inspectors. Am I hammering that point home?
Yeah.
So yeah, they're all private initiatives, and that doesn't mean that that's not well intended, etc. But that means that it's look, if you're going to get something through fair trade, it's very likely, untainted by forced labor, and specifically if you compare it to a T-shirt for $2 at, Big W. But yeah, I think certification for that reason has shortfalls as well.
Tracking goods used in products can be complicated, and Justine, you mentioned the mobile phone, and we know that there are over 600 components in a mobile phone. Is there a role for technology in helping us to try and decode all this?
Are you going to explain blockchain, Justine?
No, you could explain blockchain.
Yeah, that was.
I can
a
explain blockchain in
question.
one sentence. But over to you.
Okay.
I want to hear how you do it. Actually.
Okay, good. Sure. Okay, so you're all familiar with blockchain, and apparently it's going to solve all the world's.
Can you describe blockchain?
Yeah, no, I will.
Yeah,
I'm getting there. So blockchain basically is an online ledger of transactions. So the idea is that every time a transaction is made, those transactions are linked together as blocks, hence the name blockchain. And once that blockchain is established, it can't be retrospectively manipulated. So basically, in a supply chain, for example, you can create a record from the origin of a product all the way to the end user if it is scanned all the time. So you can see where it comes from, but you have the option to include all sorts of data around labor conditions and include that data in the block on the chain. Importantly, people need to verify those transactions. So, for example, a worker and an employer could both verify that transaction and say, this product has been produced here without any exploitation taking place, and I have actually been paid the legal entitlement. So, as a potential theoretical technological fix for this problem, it could work. However, obviously, blockchain's been touted as a solution to everything, and doesn't take long to realize that, as a matter of fact, there's no such thing as a quick technological solution for a complex social problem. So Justine and I wrote a paper on that. A number of issues can be identified. One of them is that, in that process where people get to validate a transaction, who can guarantee that everyone gets a voice in that process? That's very hard. The other thing is, we talk about illegally produced goods that are worth billions and billions. So there are avenues, even though blockchain can't be retrospectively manipulated, there are ways to sort of use that validation process and, if you will, sanitize illegally produced goods and bring that into the blockchain. And then obviously, because blockchain's holy, everyone's going to say, well, blockchain, clearly this product has been produced properly. So yeah, in short, we don't really believe in a quick technological fix for a complicated, complex social problem.
There's clearly so much to talk. It's excellent.
I would have done it a lot simpler.
Your opportunity may come in a moment, because I'm just about to start to open up to questions. So we're not going to be sharing our microphones because all these are super sanitized after we've put them down. So when you ask a question, can you please stand up and speak loudly? So are there any questions? There's so much to talk about. I wanted to keep on asking you questions, but let me just start. Here's one.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got to repeat the question. The first part of the question was a comment about the amnesty. The questioner said that in 1981, at the time of the last amnesty, the positive effects of that were hard to determine. In fact, in some cases, took up to 2 decades to see the effects there. And then the second part of the question related to businesses that are unlawful. The Modern Slavery Act deals with large corporations, but there are other businesses too that might be implicated in the employment of people who are experiencing modern slavery.
Yes, I mean, one thing that we don't really even get to in the book is the informal sector. So that's not a legal side, but if you look at the formal sector, which is where you have a relationship with your employer, etc., there's a lot of informal work done, particularly in developing economies, but also within Australia. And it's largely unregulated. So those people basically have no recourse to the Fair Work Ombudsman or really anywhere else. So that's a whole element of precarious work. And then you briefly mentioned sort of the sex trafficking side. So in our book, we're focused on supply chains, but the most common form of modern slavery in Australia is forced marriage and sexual exploitation. And again, that's one of those things which the government report into this area of modern slavery was called hidden in plain sight. So there's a lot of businesses which are both formal, informal, legal, and sort of technically illegal, which are in plain sight, and we use them all the time. But we don't realise that the level of exploitation, and that might go from workers in a nail bar, manicure workers, to sex workers, to agricultural workers. There's a lot of informal work done which is simply unregulated, and exploitation is massive.
The question is about exploitation of people on temporary visas in Australia. There is widespread wage theft in Australia. Martijn?
No, that's a very good point, and that's why we made the argument about the continuum of exploitation, because you can't talk about modern slavery if you don't have a discussion about decent work. So more and more people experience precarity, whether that's because you're casually employed, whether that's you have a limitation on the amount of hours that you can work, and that puts people at risk. And if those risk factors are compounded, for example, in addition to the fact that you are in debt, maybe you're even in debt to the person who supplied you with the job, etc., then you get those fertile grounds for further exploitation. And the idea of modern slavery, and specifically sort of the evil geniuses, if you will, that perpetrate that, they orchestrate that. They prey on people's desperation. They say to people overseas that are perhaps in a poorer country than Australia, they say, well, you can come over here, I'll pay your ticket, I'll pay all the stuff with the visa stuff, you don't have to worry about that, and this is what you'll be making. And then they get here, turns out they're in debt, and they're not actually making as much money. They can actually hardly pay the interest on whatever outstanding debt they have, which put the employer in complete control of the situation. But yeah, I agree with you absolutely. More broadly, we've seen, and this has also been termed in terms of risk. So the risk normally lay more with the employer to see, okay, well, how many people do I need to do a job, and how many people do I need to employ permanently, and if employing too many people, that's the employer's problem. Now all the risk is shifted towards workers themselves. So there's more and more people casually employed, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, as we see that shift, I think that also is one of these compounding factors that can lead to exploitation.
And sorry, just one other thing to notice, you said large companies. So the Act requires the large companies to report, but in the large company supply chain are lots of small companies. So in essence, what those small companies now are doing are on notice because the large companies are requiring them to report to them. So I think actually that's a really innovative part of the Act, which is interesting. It's putting burden on small ones, but they are getting caught into the dragnet.
So this is I think this is a question that really goes to the heart of what we're discussing, and it is about modern slavery is inherently about a power imbalance between those with power and those without. So regardless of the sector, this is always an issue, and we can see in the work that we do in Australia that it continues to be an issue across the board. Would either of you like to comment on this?
Well, it's actually very simple, if you will. Like, if you have an employer and if there's a power imbalance, then you should band together with your fellow employees in order to try and put some more weight in the scale. That's called unionizing. And look, it's astonishing for me that we've seen dwindling membership numbers of unions, given that the power disparity between employers and employees has grown so much. Obviously, those trends are in some way probably correlated, but unions are active in this because, as I mentioned, a lot of people that are vulnerable to modern slavery are part of a transient workforce or otherwise, not very familiar with their labor rights or in low-paid industries, so they might be worried that they can't pay their union fees. But they have tried sort of new organizing ways to engage people that might not be native English speakers. They've also have new membership models which are more affordable for people in low-paid industries in order to try and get those people to exercise a collective voice. Because ultimately, in the alternative to exiting the employer relationship, the alternative is ultimately to have a strong collective voice to claim your rights. Yeah.
Thanks, Martijn. So the question is whether the book looks at the impact of exploitation of Indigenous people in Australia.
Well, I think you might recall that our Prime Minister earlier this year said there was never any slavery in Australia. So we just, we took that as is and we didn't look at it. No, so the book has some, particularly the first chapter, which talks about where the term modern slavery came from and its historical origins, but we don't have a specific focus on Indigenous slavery in Australia, which has existed. There are some great, really scholarly approaches. There's a woman in Western Australia, her name's blank for a moment, who's done some really great work on this. But there's a history of Indigenous. Who was it?
Jane Leyden.
Yes, Jane Leyden. So have a look at her work on that. So we touch on it, but we don't go in depth in it.
The other thing that I'd say about that is that there has been a historical debate about the way that we describe exploitation, and a huge debate about whether or not it's appropriate to use words like slavery. And, the debate has been quite sterile. Historians have often made comments about whether it's possible to have slavery in Australia. But I think what we need to do is to actually look at the conditions of harm, look at how people are treated. Are they chained? Do they have autonomy over their life? Are they in domestic servitude? Can they leave the place that they're working or not? And I think if you apply these kinds of criteria to a situation that have befallen people for centuries, then it's absolutely beyond doubt that there has been exploitation of such a serious kind that regardless of what it's called, it is a grave breach of human rights. And in the language of today, we would call it modern slavery. Michael, did you have a question? So I'm going to ask you to look at that really quickly, Justine, and then I'm going to make some concluding comments.
Sure. So that's a great question and what Martijn talked about at the start was that we talk about modern slavery as on this continuum of exploitation. So sometimes there's not this easy black and white line. It is very grey. But what you're looking for is basically this element of coercion or threat or penalty. So wage standards different, wage rates differ around the world. So being paid a lower wage is not going to turn it into modern slavery. Basically, modern slavery as a term includes things like forced labour, trafficking, child labour, forced marriage, debt bondage. And most of these have this element of a threat of penalty of coercion. So if you're working in Vietnam, you may be being paid a very low wage, and there's also this threat or penalty, and you don't have the ability to leave the job. So that's when there's sort of this tipping point. But it's not easy to find. Workers won't easily, admit it. So it's not something where you can tick a box and say, that's it, that's the slavery I'm looking for. In many circumstances, it's really difficult to understand.
Look, these are enormous issues, and I'm going to turn to an excellent book to conclude this session. And Justine and Martijn say, what is evident is that addressing modern slavery requires a focus on two things, collaboration and connectivity. And that is it in a nutshell. And then they conclude on an optimistic note. They say that together...
Which you weren't expecting, were you?
No, so I thought I'd do it because I can't leave it.
It's through gritted teeth as well.
And I'm having the last word because I'm the chair. So my last word is they say, together we can take actions, small and large, to eradicate it. And we can. So it's not doom and gloom. Have a look at the book. You'll be able to get these two wonderful authors to sign it after the break. I want to ask you something in a minute or two that I have left. So one of the huge issues has been raising awareness about modern slavery. And here we are in a community of crime writers. Wouldn't it be wonderful to see more of an exposition of these issues within crime writing? We've seen a couple of novels, for example. Gabrielle Lord wrote a novel on forced marriage called Dishonour. There's been a couple of other forced marriage novels, but in Australia, no novels or no other writing of that type, no poetry, no short stories about the themes of modern slavery. That's what I wanted to ask you about.
Though, can I say
and
there
you
was
know who you are.
but there was a great Australian film just recently, Buoyancy, that was funded and made in Australia by an Australian director. Buoyancy, which is about basically Thai fishing men who are caught on a boat.
Yeah.
And I know that you do have the last word, but the other thing I just wanted to say, I never allow that, was Jennifer runs an organisation called Anti-Slavery International based at UTS, which provides free assistance to survivors and victims of modern slavery. And if that's an organisation you haven't heard of or not aware, then have a look at their website because they're doing extraordinary work, and that's something that is worth, investing your time and money in if you're looking at what you can do in the short term.
Yep, Anti-Slavery Australia. Anti-Slavery International is another outfit, so any donations. But it is actually pretty remarkable. So we've been providing legal advice for over 17 years. We have 300 clients today. Most of them are were exploited on the east coast of Australia, most in New South Wales, in hospitality, in factories, in agriculture. So the legal advice that we are offering is remarkable. And, we're proud to do it because when people are in modern slavery, almost every one of their human rights has been taken away from them. So we can do work that will empower people and assist people into the future. A client this week sent me you're going to be so jealous maybe, sent me a photo of a house that she's just bought. People are recovering, people are empowered, and the work that we do does impact on that. So thank you for my last word. I think I would like to ask you all to thank our wonderful guests, our wonderful panellists. You did a great job. It was just wonderful. So much to talk about, and you did it in such a short time. And as you've heard several times, they will be available to sign copies of their books next to the festival bookshop opposite the cafe. And we're asking you again to stand 1.5 metres apart from each other and to sanitise the pens between sessions. But maybe you two could just use one pen.
Well, as academics, that's a novelty because our students never ask us to.
No. So on that, now I've got one last thing to say. Please leave the room at the end of the session, even if you'll be in here for the next session because the room needs to be sanitised. Enjoy the rest of the festival. It's been wonderful to be with you, and write a book about modern slavery. Thank you.